HOA, Karen parked 3 trucks in my garage. I locked them in and called the sheriff. How does a situation like that even happen? And once those trucks are inside, who really has the upper hand? If stories like this are your kind of ride, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. What would you do if someone treated your garage like it belonged to them? Now let me take you back to the exact moment everything started, because what happened next unfolded one decision at a time, and every second mattered more than anyone standing there could have imagined. The loudest people usually believe the law belongs to them, right up until a locked door proves otherwise. The deep rumble of diesel engines rolled across the quiet cul-de-sac before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops. I had barely finished my first sip of coffee when the vibration reached the concrete floor beneath my boots. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with exhaust fumes as I stepped onto my driveway and froze. 3 white work trucks, each carrying the familiar magnetic logo of our HOA maintenance contractor, were lined up in front of my house. Before I could even process what I was seeing, the first truck eased forward, its tires crunching over my driveway, then disappeared into my garage. The second followed without hesitation. Then the third. Metal shelving rattled against the walls as engines echoed through the enclosed space that had been my workshop for nearly 8 years. Nobody knocked. Nobody asked. Nobody even looked in my direction. They acted like the place already belonged to them. I could hear men laughing over the sound of idling engines while someone slid stacks of lumber and toolboxes onto the garage floor where my project Mustang usually sat. My pulse stayed steady, but the metallic taste of disbelief settled in my mouth. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 42 years old, a mechanic by trade, and every wrench hanging on those walls was paid for one repair job at a time. After my divorce, that garage became more than a place to park my truck. It became my livelihood. I rebuilt transmissions there, restored classic cars there, spent late nights with the radio, humming softly while the smell of motor oil and fresh paint reminded me that honest work could still put a life back together. Every shelf had a purpose. Every tool had its place. Even the old rolling toolbox in the corner had belonged to my father before he retired. Watching strangers fill that space without permission felt less like an inconvenience and more like someone walking into my living room and rearranging family photographs. Then she arrived. Karen Davenport stepped out of her white luxury SUV wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying a clipboard like it was a badge. She didn't hurry. She never did. She walked with the confidence of someone who had spent years believing nobody would ever challenge her decisions. Without so much as a greeting, she glanced toward my garage, nodded once to the workers, and scribbled something on her paperwork. When our eyes finally met, her smile never reached them. "Temporary community storage," she said calmly. The board approved it. I looked from her to the trucks, then back to the open garage door where my own property had vanished behind equipment that wasn't mine. The morning breeze carried the smell of diesel deeper into the garage, drowning out the familiar scent of grease and steel. I reached into my pocket, wrapped my fingers around the small garage remote I carried every day, and quietly realized something Karen had clearly overlooked. She thought those 3 trucks had just claimed my garage. She never stopped to consider who still controlled the only door. Ethan Walker, that is me, and I have learned that people reveal exactly who they are when they believe there will never be consequences. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue across the driveway. I simply stood there listening to the engines idle while the vibrations traveled through the concrete floor that I had poured with my father almost 10 years earlier. Every crack in that slab carried a memory. Every cabinet on those walls had been measured twice before being mounted. The red steel workbench in the back corner still had a faint burn mark from the first welding project my younger brother and I finished together before he moved across the country. Most people looked at my garage and saw 4 walls and a roof. I saw thousands of evenings, countless repairs, and a second chance at building a life after everything else had fallen apart. The workers unloading those trucks did not seem rude. In fact, they looked confused more than anything else. One of them even gave me an apologetic shrug while rolling a large air compressor toward the back wall. It was obvious they were following instructions from someone else. Their supervisor glanced toward Karen every few seconds before making another decision, almost like he was waiting for silent approval. That told me something important. Karen was directing every move. She wanted everyone in the neighborhood to see it happen. The morning air smelled like fresh lumber and diesel fuel instead of the familiar mix of motor oil and rubber that usually drifted from my workspace. A pair of neighbors slowed their morning walk across the street. They whispered to each other while pretending not to stare. Another man walking his dog paused just long enough to shake his head before continuing down the sidewalk. Nobody wanted to become the next target of the homeowners association. I understood that feeling. Over the past 2 years, Karen had become famous for finding reasons to send violation notices over the smallest details. A garden hose left out overnight. A basketball goal visible from the street. A mailbox that was supposedly the wrong shade of black. Every month there seemed to be another rule, another letter, another reminder that she believed authority meant control. Until that morning, she had never crossed onto my property without permission. Now she was standing inside my open garage like she owned every square foot of it. She tapped her clipboard and smiled with complete confidence. Temporary inconvenience, Mr. Walker. Community improvement projects require cooperation. We appreciate your understanding. Her words sounded polished, almost rehearsed, but they landed with all the warmth of cold steel. I glanced at the remote resting quietly inside my hand. She had spent so much time planning how to move those trucks inside that she had forgotten one very simple fact. This building was not managed by the homeowners association. It was not maintained by their contractor. It was not connected to any community access system. Every switch, every lock, every garage door motor, every security camera, and every entry code answered to exactly one person. Me. I slipped my phone from my pocket without attracting attention and opened the security camera application. 3 clear camera angles captured every license plate, every truck, every worker, every instruction, and every minute ticking by. I saved the live recording to cloud storage, locked my phone again, and quietly took one slow breath. Sometimes the smartest move is not stopping someone before they make a mistake. Sometimes the smartest move is letting them finish making it. Karen must have mistaken silence for surrender because she never bothered asking what I was doing while she turned my garage into her temporary warehouse. She spent the next 20 minutes directing workers from one side of the building to the other, pointing at shelves, measuring open floor space, and discussing where additional materials would fit if more deliveries arrived later that afternoon. Every sentence carried the same confident tone of someone who believed the decision had already become permanent. The workers continued unloading plywood, traffic cones, portable generators, and stacks of boxed hardware. I noticed one young employee hesitate before placing a heavy toolbox against my workbench. He quietly apologized and explained that he was only following the schedule his supervisor had received the night before. I nodded and told him I understood. None of this was his decision. That mattered. People following instructions are different from people inventing them. Karen, however, enjoyed every second. She slowly walked through my garage with her clipboard tucked under one arm, occasionally brushing dust from her jacket as though she were inspecting property she had managed for years. She even commented that the extra storage space would improve efficiency for the neighborhood renovation project. I almost laughed. My private garage had somehow become community property in her imagination simply because she had declared it so. The smell of fresh lumber, mixed with the familiar scent of transmission fluid still lingering from the pickup truck I had repaired the previous evening. That combination reminded me exactly why I had built this place. It was never just another room attached to my house. It represented independence. Nobody had handed it to me. I had spent weekends framing walls, installing insulation, running electrical wiring, and mounting every storage cabinet with my own hands. After my divorce, friends suggested selling the house and starting over somewhere else. I refused. Instead, I rebuilt my life one project at a time inside those walls. Looking around now, I realized Karen had never asked what the garage meant to me because she assumed the answer did not matter. She believed authority replaced permission. Across the street, more neighbors had begun gathering near the sidewalk under the excuse of walking their dogs or checking their mail. Quiet conversations drifted across the cool morning air. Nobody wanted to interrupt, but everyone understood they were witnessing something unusual. Karen noticed the audience as well. Her posture straightened, and her smile grew wider. She enjoyed performing confidence almost as much as exercising power. Then she pulled a folded document from her clipboard and waved it lightly in my direction. She never offered it for me to read. She simply announced that the board had approved temporary use of available space for essential community equipment. Available space. Those two words echoed in my head. She did not say private property, because that would have reminded everyone who actually owned the building. She chose language that made my garage sound like an empty parking lot waiting for instructions. I looked once more at the 3 trucks, now sitting comfortably behind the open garage door. Their drivers had already left to help unload supplies. Every vehicle remained parked inside with the keys nowhere in sight. I slipped the remote back into my pocket and glanced toward the wall-mounted control panel just inside the entrance. The quiet hum of the garage door motor suddenly sounded very different to me. Karen believed she had completed her biggest move of the day. In reality, she had just placed every piece exactly where I needed it before making my first move at all. I slowly walked toward the side entrance of the house as if I had accepted everything she had decided. Karen barely looked at me anymore. In her mind, the conversation was over because she had already declared herself the winner. That confidence was almost impressive. She believed a clipboard carried the same weight as a property deed. Inside my kitchen, the familiar smell of fresh coffee replaced the diesel drifting in through the open doorway. I set my mug on the counter, pulled out my phone again, and reviewed the camera feeds one by one. Every angle was crystal clear. The front driveway camera showed each truck crossing onto my property. The garage camera captured every worker entering with equipment. Another camera mounted near the ceiling clearly recorded Karen directing the operation while pointing deeper inside my garage. There were no missing moments, no blind spots, no room for creative explanations later. I uploaded duplicate copies of every recording to cloud storage, then emailed another copy to myself so the original timestamps would remain untouched. Years of running a small business had taught me that documentation always speaks more calmly than angry words ever can. I opened the folder containing my property survey, the closing documents from when I bought the house, and the permit showing the detached workshop had later been expanded into the attached garage exactly as approved by the county. Every document listed the same legal description. There was nothing shared about that space. It was private property from the driveway to the back wall. While I organized everything, I could still hear Karen outside giving instructions. At one point, she actually laughed and suggested moving another pallet closer to my tool cabinets because there was, in her words, plenty of unused room. Unused. I glanced toward the security monitor where my half-finished restoration project sat squeezed against the far wall behind stacks of construction materials that did not belong there. That single word told me she had never considered asking what happened inside those walls every day. To her, if she did not personally see the space being used, then it existed for her convenience. My phone buzzed with a message from my attorney, Daniel Brooks. He had handled the paperwork when I purchased the house several years earlier. I briefly explained what was happening and attached 2 screenshots from the security footage. His reply arrived less than 2 minutes later. Do not argue. Preserve the evidence. If they remain on your property without permission, let the facts speak for themselves. Reading that message settled every remaining doubt. I was not dealing with a misunderstanding anymore. I was dealing with someone who believed confidence could replace ownership. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked outside again. The workers were finishing their unloading, wiping sweat from their foreheads under the late morning sun. Karen looked pleased with herself as she checked another box on her clipboard. She smiled when she noticed me returning, expecting another protest that she could dismiss in front of the growing audience of curious neighbors. Instead, I simply nodded once, reached into my pocket, and quietly pressed the garage door remote. The electric motor came to life with its familiar steady hum as the wide overhead door began lowering inch by inch, sealing all 3 trucks exactly where they were. The heavy door rolled downward with its familiar mechanical rhythm until the last strip of daylight disappeared beneath the bottom seal. The electric motor clicked once, then fell silent. For the first time that morning, the neighborhood became almost perfectly quiet. Even the workers stopped talking. Karen stared at the closed garage for several long seconds before looking back at me with an expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief. "What are you doing?" she asked, still expecting the answer to fit neatly into whatever authority she imagined she possessed. I slipped the remote back into my pocket without hurrying. "Closing my garage," I answered calmly. "It is where I keep my property." She laughed once, although it Sounded forced this time. Open it again. We are not finished. I simply looked at her. I did not invite anyone inside to begin with. One of the contractors slowly walked over, wiping dust from his gloves. He looked far more uncomfortable than anyone else standing there. Sir, he said politely, our trucks are still inside. I nodded. Yes, they are. He glanced toward Karen before speaking again. Could you open the door so we can move them? I could see he was trying to avoid becoming part of an argument that had nothing to do with him. I respected that. I'm going to make a phone call first, I replied. Karen took 2 quick steps toward me, gripping her clipboard tighter than before. You cannot hold company vehicles. The confidence in her voice was beginning to crack around the edges. Actually, I answered, they are parked inside my private garage without my permission. Those words hung in the air much longer than I expected. Nobody interrupted them. Nobody argued with the facts themselves. The workers exchanged uncertain looks. One quietly pulled out his phone and stepped away, apparently calling his supervisor. Across the street, more neighbors had gathered near the sidewalk. They were no longer pretending to check their mail. Everyone understood something important had changed. Karen had spent the entire morning controlling the situation. Now she was reacting instead of directing. I unlocked my phone and opened the non-emergency number for the sheriff's office that I had saved months earlier after attending a neighborhood safety meeting. I deliberately pressed the speaker button so nobody could later claim they misunderstood what I reported. When the dispatcher answered, I introduced myself, gave my address, and calmly explained that several vehicles had been brought into my private garage without permission during an unauthorized use of my property. I emphasized that there was no emergency, no immediate danger, and that I simply wanted a deputy to document the situation and determine the proper next steps. The dispatcher thanked me, confirmed the location, and explained that a deputy was already available nearby. Karen immediately stepped closer. You seriously called the sheriff? She asked, almost whispering now. I looked directly at her and answered with the same calm tone I had maintained all morning. I called the only person whose opinion actually matters when private property is involved. The breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut lumber across the driveway again, but now the entire scene felt different. The trucks had not moved an inch. The garage door remained firmly shut, and for the first time since sunrise, Karen looked like someone who realized that confidence alone was never going to unlock my garage. The next 10 minutes felt strangely peaceful, almost like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Nobody touched the garage door. Nobody tried forcing it open. The workers gathered near the driveway, speaking quietly among themselves while checking their phones for instructions that never seemed to arrive. Karen, on the other hand, refused to stand still. She paced back and forth across my driveway, tapping impatiently on her phone before making another call. Every few moments, she glanced at the closed garage, as though staring hard enough might somehow make it open by itself. I stayed exactly where I was, leaning lightly against my mailbox with my arms relaxed at my sides. There was nothing left for me to prove. The evidence was already recorded. The trucks were exactly where they had been left. The property lines had not moved. Time was now working for me instead of against me. A few minutes later, a dark blue pickup pulled into the street. The maintenance company's regional supervisor stepped out wearing a reflective safety vest and carrying a folder under his arm. The expression on his face changed almost immediately after Karen hurried over and began explaining the situation with animated gestures. I watched him glance from her to my garage, then toward the workers waiting nearby. Instead of arguing with me, he walked over with a calm, professional expression. Good morning, he said politely. I am Mark Reynolds with Summit Property Maintenance. I understand there has been some confusion. I shook his hand. Good morning. He looked toward the closed garage door before asking. The question I had expected all along. Did anyone receive your permission before using your garage? No, I answered. He nodded once without hesitation. Do you have security footage? Multiple camera angles, I replied, and copies stored off-site. His eyebrows lifted slightly, almost with quiet appreciation. Behind him, Karen interrupted before he could respond. She insisted the Homeowners Association had approved temporary storage for the renovation project and claimed everyone should simply cooperate for the benefit of the neighborhood. Mark slowly turned toward her. Did you obtain written permission from the homeowner? The question landed with surprising force because it required only one answer. Karen hesitated. The board approved the project. Mark asked again. this time even more directly. Did the homeowner authorize access to his private garage? A long silence followed. She looked at her clipboard as though hoping the correct answer might suddenly appear between the pages. It never did. Mark let out a slow breath and rubbed the back of his neck. Our contract requires permission before entering private structures, he said quietly. If that did not happen, then we have a serious problem. For the first time all morning, Karen did not have an immediate response. She simply folded her arms and stared at the closed garage door. Around us, neighbors continued gathering along the sidewalk, speaking softly as they watched the conversation unfold. Nobody was laughing anymore. The situation had stopped looking like an ordinary disagreement and started looking exactly like what it was. My phone vibrated once. The sheriff's dispatcher had sent a text confirming that a deputy was only a few minutes away. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without saying a word. Karen noticed the movement and suddenly understood what it meant. The confidence that had carried her through the morning finally disappeared from her face, replaced by something she had not expected to feel on my driveway. Uncertainty. The distant sound of a patrol vehicle grew louder until a sheriff's pickup turned slowly into the cul-de-sac, its tires rolling across the pavement with quiet confidence instead of urgency. The deputy stepped out, adjusted the brim of his hat, and took a slow look around before saying a single word. He was not interested in the loudest voice. He was interested in the facts. "Good morning," he said evenly. "Who owns the property?" I raised my hand. "I do." He nodded and wrote something in a small notebook before turning toward Karen. "And your role?" She immediately introduced herself as president of the Homeowners Association and began explaining the neighborhood improvement project, emphasizing how important the work was for the community. She spoke quickly, pointing toward the garage and then toward the workers waiting nearby. The deputy listened without interrupting, his expression never changing. When she finished, he looked back at me. "Did you authorize anyone to enter your garage or park vehicles inside?" "No, sir," I answered. "Did anyone ask for permission?" "No, sir." He made another note before asking if I had any documentation. That was the moment I had been preparing for since the first truck crossed my driveway. I unlocked my phone and opened the folder containing the security recordings. Standing beside the deputy, I played the first clip. The camera clearly showed the trucks entering my property. The second angle captured Karen directing workers into the garage. Another recording showed equipment being unloaded while I remained outside. Timestamps appeared in the corner of every video. Dates, hours, minutes, and seconds. Nothing had been edited. Nothing had been cut. The deputy watched each recording carefully without rushing. When the final clip ended, he handed the phone back to me and asked one simple question. "Do you have proof of ownership for the property?" I opened another folder containing my closing documents and the county property records that Daniel had told me to keep ready. The deputy reviewed the address, compared it with my driver's license, and quietly nodded. He then turned toward Mark Reynolds from the maintenance company. "Were your employees instructed to enter this garage?" Mark answered honestly. "Yes, but we were told authorization had already been obtained." The deputy looked toward Karen again. "Can you provide written permission from the homeowner?" Silence settled over the driveway. Karen flipped through her clipboard page after page, but every movement became slower than the last. She finally admitted that she only had approval from the Homeowners Association board. The deputy closed his notebook. "Board approval does not replace permission from a private property owner," he said calmly. "Those are two different things." Even the neighbors standing across the street became completely quiet. Nobody whispered anymore. Nobody pretended to check the mail. Everyone had just heard the same sentence. Karen's authority stopped at the neighborhood rules. It did not extend through the walls of my garage. The deputy then looked at me and asked the question that mattered most. "Would you like these vehicles removed under your supervision after we finish documenting everything?" I smiled politely for the first time that morning. "Yes, sir," I replied. "That is exactly what I would like to happen." The deputy asked everyone to remain where they were while he finished documenting the scene, and the entire mood of the neighborhood shifted from confrontation to quiet accountability. Nobody argued anymore. Nobody raised a voice. The only sounds were birds in the trees and the occasional beep from construction equipment still sitting behind my garage door. The deputy photographed the driveway, the exterior of the garage, and the security camera mounted above the entrance. He also recorded the license plate of each truck before asking Mark Reynolds to identify the drivers assigned to the vehicles. Mark cooperated without hesitation. He explained that his crew had accepted the assignment, believing all required permissions had already been secured. The deputy thanked him for his honesty and made careful notes. Then he looked at Karen once more. "This appears to be a civil property matter involving unauthorized access," he explained calmly. "My role today is to document what occurred and ensure everyone leaves the property peacefully." Karen attempted one last argument. She insisted that the renovation project served the entire neighborhood, and that temporary inconvenience should not matter. The deputy listened respectfully before answering with a sentence that every neighbor standing nearby could hear. "Community projects do not eliminate private property rights." Nobody responded because there was nothing to argue with. The statement was simple, clear, and impossible to misunderstand. He then asked whether I was willing to allow the vehicles to be removed under his observation once the documentation was complete. "Of course," I answered. "I simply wanted everything recorded correctly before anything changed." He nodded with quiet approval. "That is a reasonable request." After taking several final photographs, the deputy turned toward me and said I could open the garage whenever I felt comfortable. I reached into my pocket, pressed the remote, and the familiar electric motor came to life once again. The overhead door lifted slowly, revealing the 3 trucks exactly where they had been left. Nothing inside had been touched since I closed the door. The workers climbed into their vehicles one by one, but before anyone started an engine, Mark stopped them. He walked through the garage with 2 employees, carefully removing every pallet, every toolbox, every traffic cone, every generator, and every piece of construction material that had been placed inside without permission. They worked methodically, treating my garage with far more respect than it had received earlier that morning. As each item disappeared, I finally saw my workbench, my tool cabinets, and my father's old red toolbox again. The familiar smell of motor oil gradually replaced the scent of fresh lumber. It felt like my garage was breathing normally again. Before leaving, Mark apologized directly. He assured me his company would conduct an internal review to determine how such an instruction had been approved without verifying homeowner authorization. I thanked him because his response reflected professionalism instead of excuses. Karen remained unusually quiet throughout the entire process. She watched as the last truck backed carefully onto the driveway and rolled toward the street. The same neighbors who had witnessed the beginning of the morning now watched its conclusion. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. They simply observed a straightforward reminder that confidence can never substitute for ownership, and that respecting another person's property is not optional, no matter what title appears on a clipboard. By late afternoon, the neighborhood had returned to its usual rhythm, but something had quietly changed in ways that were impossible to ignore. The sheriff's truck pulled away after confirming that everything had been documented, and the last maintenance vehicle disappeared around the corner without leaving a single piece of equipment behind. I stood alone in my garage for a long moment, listening to the familiar silence that had been missing since sunrise. The faint scent of motor oil drifted through the room again, mixing with the clean smell of fresh concrete that always seemed to appear after the overhead door had been open for a while. My workbench was exactly where I had left it. My father's old red toolbox sat in its corner, untouched. The half-finished Mustang waited patiently under its protective cover, almost as if it had been reminding me all day that real work eventually outlasts unnecessary drama. I slowly returned every tool to its proper place, not because anything had been moved very far, but because restoring order felt important. Sometimes reclaiming your space is just as meaningful as defending it. A few neighbors walked by during the evening, each offering a quiet wave or a respectful nod. None of them asked for details. They had already seen everything that mattered with their own eyes. One elderly neighbor smiled and simply said, "People will remember today." I smiled back because I believed he was right. Not because anyone had been embarrassed, but because the entire neighborhood had been reminded that rules only work when they respect the law instead of trying to replace it. 2 days later, I received a phone call from Mark Reynolds. He apologized once again on behalf of his company and confirmed they had updated their procedures. From that point forward, no employee would enter private property for storage or staging without written authorization directly from the homeowner. It was a simple policy, but sometimes the simplest policies prevent the biggest mistakes. A week after that, another envelope arrived from the Homeowners Association. This time it was not a violation notice or another list of neighborhood regulations. It announced that future renovation projects would require documented homeowner consent whenever private property might be affected. I read the letter once, folded it neatly, and placed it inside the same filing cabinet where I kept my property records. Not because I expected another situation like this, but because preparation had served me well before, and it would continue serving me in the future. Looking back now, I never considered that morning a personal victory over Karen. I considered it a reminder that staying calm is often more powerful than speaking loudly. Cameras record facts. Documents preserve facts. Property lines define facts. When those facts remain on your side, patience becomes your strongest advantage. Every time I press the garage remote now, I still hear the same steady hum of the motor closing the door at the end of another honest day's work. It reminds me that justice does not always arrive with dramatic speeches or heated arguments. Sometimes it arrives quietly, one careful decision at a time, until the truth is the only thing left standing. And every single time that garage door closes, I remember one lesson that no neighborhood rule will ever change. Respect is requested, ownership is documented, but the law is never decided by the loudest person on the driveway.